what I'm going to talk about today is really what I see as our biggest challenge in terms of climate. Because actually what we need to do is, as Charlie said, we need to move from an old system to a new system. And the problem with the old system is it has so much vested in it already. So we have a system that was essentially implemented sort of when we had large power stations. I, for a brief period of time, taught some physics to A-level students. And when I used to read the Nuffield physics books, were meant to be the most progressive physics books. They were meant to be the ones that really thought about practical physics. And you went out and tested it and see what happened. And in these physics books, I just remember, and this was before I was even really interested in renewables particularly, I read it and it said, you've got to do energy in a big centralised power station with big levers and big electricity networks to deliver power to people. And I just said, really? Is that the only way? And to a certain extent, we've been teaching generations of engineers, generations of physicists to think that way. The other thing is that we've also been teaching generations of financiers that their balance sheet is the most important thing they have. So what I hope to do, and I apologise, I will try and not dwell too much on the numbers. I want to try and sort of show the picture that we are really facing. And for me, the issue about climate change is not, do we have the technology to solve it? It's not, there's a lot of people who do want to solve it. The issue becomes hugely political and hugely financial because the economics and the engineering stack up. What doesn't stack up is the city and the politics, I'm afraid. And I'm hoping I will give you an outline of why I think that's the case and what are the things we have to start facing full on. And if nothing else, maybe write to your pension companies when you leave to tell them they've got to divest. So, I'm sure most people know this, but I just always want to remind, I read a brilliant book this summer. I went on holiday, and sometimes you need to take time out. I went off to Austria and ate nothing for a week, which was very good for me. Well, a bit of juice, actually. And I did a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. And I read a brilliant book, and if anybody gets a chance to read a book by Bill McKibben called Oil and Honey, it's this lovely story of his campaign under 350.org in the US. But also then going back every time he was on the road, manically trying to persuade Obama not to put the Keystone pipeline in place. He'd go home and then he'd do some beekeeping. And it kind of kept himself going. It kept him thinking about reality and what was going on. And then also he talks about the story of how the climate is affecting the bees. So it's a beautiful story. But one of the things he does very clearly in there is he says you have to keep preaching to the converted. Because we all say we mustn't preach to the converted. We must just preach to those people who don't know anything. Well, actually, we need to remind ourselves and the people who are converted what the stats are, what the information is, keep ourselves updated. Because that's what he said was the core of the 350 in the US. So that's why I've put this slide up. So current emissions are 50 billion a year. To keep it in a 2 degrees path, we have to drop to 40 billion tonnes by 2030. And by 2050, it has to be 20 tonnes. And one of the things, I don't know whether anybody understands, we're at about 0.8 degrees warming right now. Now what that means is that we can cope with that. It's sort of, we're seeing some more extreme weather events, we've got more energy in the system. That's what happens with climate change, is essentially you've got more energy, so you're going to have more precipitation, more wind, more sun, more heat. So that's what happens with climate. The issue is when you get to 2 degrees, we as humanity have never experienced this. I think it's always very good to go and look at a mountain. I went to look at a mountain last year, and I looked at it and I go, God, you've been here for years and years and years, probably pre-humanity. And actually, whatever we do to the planet in terms of climate change, you're still going to be here, but I might not. And that is the reality for me about climate change, is actually it's not about whether we're going to ruin the planet. It's the fact that it may not be habitable by us anymore, or we will destroy our society in the process. So we've never lived outside 2 degrees. We don't know what it feels like. We don't know whether our society will continue to exist. And that's why it's such an important number. And if anything, they do anything at Paris, they kind of have to keep us in a path on 2 degrees, or at least within that concept. And I can never remember her name. Mad Max star. Anybody know? That's it. God, I can never pronounce her name. I don't know why. Anyway, I mean, her view, when she gave an interview, I don't know whether anybody saw the interview in The Guardian, it basically said, this is what it might feel like. This is what we think climate will feel like, climate change. And one of the problems is that we still have a lot of climate skeptics. And despite the fact that they're relatively small, and if you look at the stats, 97% of climate scientists say that climate is related to human activity. When you actually go out there and you listen to the BBC or you listen to what's called balanced journalism, you still see the other argument. And that's fine to have some other arguments in there. But the trouble is when we present it to a wider audience, it feels like it's balanced. It feels like it's 50-50. It really isn't 50-50. And if you went to a doctor and they say, now let's say dentist, actually not doctor. If you went to the dentist and say, you have got a bad tooth, I think you should probably have it out. You're most likely, unless if you're in agony, probably going to take his advice. And that's kind of where we are. I mean, it's quite right. Maybe there's a 3% chance that the dentist might be wrong and your tooth might survive. But if you continue to go on in agony, then you're likely to take it out. And that's kind of where we are. So if you then look at where the carbon is coming from and how it's produced, the biggest area, and a lot of people talk about farting cows. A lot of farting cows. Now, agriculture, don't get me wrong, has an impact, but is not the biggest impact. The biggest impact is that we burn a lot of coal in power stations. And we burn a lot of gas in power stations. Transport sector, don't get me wrong, is really important. I think my husband did a calculation the other day. He now cycles to work every day. He saved a ton of carbon by cycling to work, which is like, if everybody saved a ton of carbon, that'd be pretty cool, actually. So transport's really important. We need to do something there. Business is important in residential. Both business and residential, that would be heating those CO2 emissions there. So again, energy efficiency, very important. But by far the biggest one is still electricity and the energy part. So we kind of need to move away from that. So we need, if we're going to address some of these areas, let's take the big ones out. And I guess that's why I started in the energy sector, the electricity sector, is because for me, it's one of the big ones. You should start with the big ones and start them moving down. And also, I think people need to focus. Sometimes people come up to me and say, maybe you should start doing stuff in the transport sector, or maybe you should. To be honest, it's pretty complex in the electricity sector as it is, and the sort of supply sector. If you start doing too many things, I feel you're not going to fix them. But one of the key things is that we now need to start moving away from this investment structure to a new investment structure. Sorry. So one of the big things, when I set up Good Energy, I was very lucky. I came across a German entrepreneur who was very inspired and very inspiring, in fact. And he wanted to set up a company that brought an option to individuals to do something about climate. So they became part of the issue, not just being big centralised systems, but decentralised systems. And one of the things he managed to do in Germany was raise a lot of money to invest in this across Europe. I mean, he was a fantastic first investor. And I met him at a drinks party, and we kind of gabbling at somebody else and then started gabbling at each other, and that's when it took off. And that was brilliant. Unfortunately, and one of my early lessons was he invested in about 20 different technologies across Europe and invested in too many things too quickly. And I'm afraid he did go bust, which was the worst thing for us at the time. And after that, I went, okay, so let's go and try and find some money from the city. I talked to the city. City don't like green things, generally. If you're talking about innovation, or if you're talking about a new tech, or if you're talking about, at the time, internet, then you were fine. But if you're talking about trying to do something to change the planet, no, they're not interested. And pretty much that's still the case today. So what do we do? So I was very lucky. We were a small company, so I used to take the phone sometimes. I used to listen to customers. And our customers kept saying, can we invest? Can we invest in your company? I thought, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So we put out a prospectus, and actually the first funding that came into the company was from 500 customers who decided to put 500 quid in each. And that was huge. It was a massive first step on the way. And what was interesting is it was the first step to exist in this market. At every step, it feels like you have to change something. Just by existing, trying to be a 100% renewable company, trying to change the way that people generate and use power. You can't, nothing is set up for that. Everything is against you. And the funding is as much of that as same now. I mean, today we're now a listed company. We have about 2,000 individual shareholders who are customers, and we have another 2,000 bondholders who raised £15 million for us to invest in some more generation. So most of our shareholders are individuals. And that's been incredibly powerful, but it's meant that that's the only way we've managed to get around the system. Because if you go and talk to the funds, even the environmental funds today, we're too small. we're too small to get most of the environmental funds to invest in us. And it's really quite depressing. You go, how big have we got to be, for heaven's sake? They tell us that we've got to be a £100 million company for them to invest, which seems so strange, because most companies that are environmental, or most companies that are starting up, are actually really small. And that's where the power is. But none of the environmental funds are focused on the small. They're all focused on the big. And so that's been really quite depressing. But I think one of the things is it does open our eyes, and we've always been quite innovative about our funding. We also want to be innovative about the way people pay us. So we recently launched the Bristol Pound, that people in Bristol can now pay with the local currency for their electricity bills. And I think this is the point, is that once you start innovating, actually you can't stop, because you kind of, every question comes to you and you go, really? Do we have to do it that way? Can't we do it differently? It gets a bit tiresome, I know, for some of my team when I go, we don't have to do it the same way as everybody else. Can we do it a different way? But what it means is that you do start to challenge everything. And I think the point about having companies in this marketplace, even though we're not the biggest, it means that we challenge all the perceived wisdom that's already there. And I can assure you the perceived wisdom is not necessarily wisdom. It's just because everybody's done it that way for years. Sorry. Whoops. There we go. So in terms of looking about moving away from carbon investment into renewable investment, one of the things that we talk about, and I don't know when anybody saw, there was a really fantastic report done recently by The Lancet, which started to talk about the health impact of climate. And one of the things we haven't seen this far is actually thinking about a wider impact. So everybody talks about CO2 emissions, and everybody talks about warmer weather, more flooding, more rainfall, more droughts, more extremes, basically. But nobody then says, what does that mean to us as individuals? And I think this is the big gap that we've seen. And I met and spoke to an amazing guy called Hugh Montgomery, who is Professor of Intensive Medicine at Imperial. And he headed up this report by The Lancet, which basically said, we are going to cost ourselves a huge amount in the NHS, in worldwide healthcare, just to cope with climate. And some of the figures we've seen is that there are some very tragic figures about when people are too cold in the winter. So there are deaths still in the UK from being too cold. But actually what we're seeing as a more prevalent one is people dying more often when it's too hot, because that is the one that we are not set up to deal with at all in this country. And I think one of the things that's not included in the cost of carbon, and one of the most difficult things for renewables to cope with, is actually renewables don't generate this, but carbon does. But this is not included in the price. So when you go and buy coal, or where you go and buy biomass or electricity, none of the carbon is actually included in that price at all. Sorry. And this is going to be the big fight that we see next. So you may have seen recently in the news, since our new government came in, that they've made a few changes. One of the changes is, and I'm afraid I've just been focused on the renewables one, because there have been quite a lot of those. But one of the key changes they've made is they've decided they don't like onshore wind. I call it the case of not in my other backyard. They mainly worry about people going down to see their second homes and having to go down past a wind turbine. And that is a serious issue. But basically, one of the things that they're basically saying is that the subsidisation of renewables is significant, but nobody is looking at the whole picture. And for me, this is the most dangerous decisions that they're making right now. So there's been announcements on onshore wind. This week, there's now a pre-announcement about solar, that they're going to cut the subsidies on solar next week. And they're changing the on planning. So it looks like getting planning on onshore wind is going to be even more difficult than it was already, if it wasn't already pretty hard. So essentially, what they're saying is renewables are all subsidised and everything. But the point is, and that's what's so sad, is that renewables are subsidised. But there is the other side of the question. They bring in other benefits. So one of the studies that we've done recently is actually showing that solar particularly is bringing down the overall price of energy in the marketplace. So the wholesale electricity price is actually being brought down. So although you're adding it on one side on the bill, you're actually reducing it on the other, and you're getting a sort of balance between the two. And this is not, well, I mean, it's been conveniently ignored, I would suggest. The other part is essentially that fossil is essentially subsidised. So there are various, and this is a piece of work, I've just been talking to the head of Friends of the Earth, that we want to do some more work about actually uncovering, because the thing about subsidies on the other side is you can't see them. They're not obvious, they're all in tax breaks, they're all in sunk costs that have already gone through. And also, they're not taking into account the costs we're now putting onto the NHS in terms of the pollution costs in the UK, apparently per year, according to the Lancet, something like 29,000 lives per year are lost due to pollution in the UK. And we don't think of ourselves as a polluted country. Can you imagine what it feels like in China, where they can barely see when you go through this? So what we're seeing essentially is the effective subsidisation of fossil, but that's not seen. And we just pulled out this figure. So if you look at Shell last year, they paid out 11.8 billion in dividends last year to their shareholders. But actually, the cost of their emissions is more than double this. So who is actually getting subsidised? Is it really renewables that is getting subsidised, or is it actually the fossil fuel industry that continues to get support this way? Sorry. And I mentioned the Lancet report. The Lancet report, it's basically a report that's pulled together a set of reports. And I think we begin to see the health sector begin to look at the fact that this is going to start to increase their costs. We already see an NHS that's incredibly under pressure in terms of costs and price. All we're going to do is add to it by the time we start putting climate change through that as well. And that's not just going to be in the UK, that will be worldwide. But at the same time, one of the things, and I never thought I would say, woe go the Pope. Don't know about anybody else. Wasn't really on my agenda. I have to say, popes have never been probably up there on my list of sort of heroes, but I have to say this man is a hero. He is a hero. He's gone out there and said something so fundamental to our society, and also fundamentally to American society. I mean, I think it's really interesting for Obama to have the Pope come into, basically be making these statements at the same time he's trying to make some very difficult decisions on climate. And it gives huge ability for politicians like Obama to actually take bold steps. And that's actually what we need. We need more people standing up shoulder to shoulder. And I'm going to sort of mention something I did recently called a constellation on climate change, which was really interesting. I'll try and explain it. I might do it very badly, but I will try and explain it. But yes, I mean, Pope Francis is amazing in this context. And I think, I'm not saying he's going to get a massive conversion to Catholicism, but I think he's going to get a lot of positivity in terms of what he's saying. And I understand there's going to be quite a sort of an epic meeting between some more of the religious leaders worldwide that will begin to put their back behind this. And if we see that, that's huge in terms of what we're seeing on this. And I think one of the other things is that although the UK might feel like it's going backwards, I think a lot of the international organisations are beginning to see this impact and beginning to say we cannot stand by while fossils can continue to be not only polluting us but also being subsidised effectively. And this was a recent report by the International Monetary Fund, which says that 6 million per minute that taxpayers are picking up worldwide on carbon. Sorry? You're right. And that's more than healthcare has been ever spent. So we are in a world that is an old world. We need to be, and these, I'm sure all these were put in place when we felt, and we kind of have to forgive ourselves from the world that we were in. Because at the time we felt that energy was free. We felt energy was essentially not going to pollute us. It was progress. It was where industrial revolution was going. It was all this support. We kind of have to forgive that and then move on and say the old system is not fit for purpose. We have to move away from that system that subsidised fossil to a world that has a much more level playing field and takes the true cost of carbon into account. Sorry. One of the really interesting things, and I'm sure people here saw the action in Holland that was taken against the Dutch government. For me, this is the thing that will suddenly start to come up, and maybe governments will start to listen. Being sued as a government, governments don't like being sued. They really don't like it getting it wrong, and civil servants particularly. And I think this kind of threat coming on the horizon. Now, I think in Holland they've got a specific structure that they can do this. So we may not be able to take the UK government to court straight away. But in terms of the fact that it's happening means that other governments will be looking at this. And I assure you that civil servants will be desperately looking at their Human Rights Acts and seeing what's in there and seeing what the impact is likely to be. And in terms of sort of the Obama administration talking about 50, I think that way underplays it. I think we're already seeing deaths higher than that in the UK and world, not just in the UK, in Europe. And I think those figures are far too low. But what is interesting about Obama is that Obama's administration recently came out with a statement that they want to invest in wind, and they think it will save their taxpayers something like £280 billion over time. And the reason for that is actually it's because they're not going to have to rely on other countries where they have to go and invade them or do deals with them to secure long-term low costs on fossil fuel. But also that investment will be there for a while, and they own it, essentially. It will be their wind power, not somebody else's. And I think this is a world that we have to move to. Sorry. So I'm afraid more numbers. What happens if we don't act? One of the big questions is actually how much are we going to have to spend just to protect what we already have? And how much do we move away from the coast? And these are really sad questions to ask ourselves, but I think the next 5 years are going to be pretty deterministic in terms of what happens. And it is now that we have to actually make some of these really hard judgments, because this is what's on the other side of it. In terms of sort of air conditioning costs, at the moment, I don't know about you, we don't have air conditioning in our offices. Most people don't have air conditioning in their homes. But if we move to a warmer climate, if we start putting air conditioning in everybody's homes, our energy use is just going to go up again. And at the moment, I don't know, the grid systems, so we've been told that the grid system in the southwest is now full. You can't put any more on it. So the grid systems are creaking as well. And this is a world that we have to start to really look at seriously. Actions to slow climate, reduce droughts by at least 40%. So one of the things that we have to look at is just not, it's also what else do we want to protect? Is it our humanity, but is it also biodiversity, and what else is going on worldwide? Sorry. So I was going to stop the figures because I thought it was a bit too much actually. So there is an alternative, and I'm not just saying it's wind power. There is an alternative. One of the pieces of work we did a long time ago was to look at, could the UK become 100% renewable? We have enough resource in this country to become 100% renewable powered. We also have the technology, although it's not implemented yet, to actually be able to balance that, because one of the other things that are thrown at renewables is that renewables are intermittent, they don't generate when I need it. It's not exactly true actually. What we find is one of our biggest trading pieces is we trade both wind and solar. And wind tends to generate more in the winter when you have a higher amount of power, and solar tends to generate in the summer, so you get a balance between those two quite nicely. When it's really windy, it doesn't tend to be as sunny, and vice versa. I know that sounds sort of maybe a bit simplistic, but it is actually when you look at the fundamentals of it. And then you begin to say, one of the things that we've never asked people in this country to do is to change the way they use their power. So I'm sure most people know when the off-peak times on a train are. They know probably if you travel after 9, you can get a cheaper ticket. Most people don't think about off-peak times on their energy, do they? So the time actually, it's something like 30% of the total capacity that we have waiting to generate power sits around because we all want to have a cup of tea between 5 and 7, between November and February. And it's an extraordinary system that. Why do we do that? Why do we do that to ourselves? Because we basically said, oh, the customer is always right and we should just do what they want. Actually, I'm sure if we all knew that we shouldn't be using power between 5 and 7, we could reduce the amount we were using at that point. We just make 1 cup of tea instead of 2. We could just think about doing things slightly differently. And if you were charged more between 5 and 7, you might change your behaviour. And it's really interesting this. It's kind of like we've been slightly condescending to the public, I think, for years about patting everybody on the head and saying, don't worry, dear, the lights will never go off. Well, the reality is they may well do one day. And actually the reality is that we're using a huge amount of carbon to keep them going as we're using them today. So for me, sort of, if we look at new solutions, renewables are part of it, but renewables are just the first step. Actually, what we need to do is do a wholesale change in terms of both the way the market works, but also the way we fund that. And also the way we get people involved. So many times when I sit on the board of various different organisations with some of these big power company chiefs. And they are so detached sometimes from their customers. They are completely, they don't actually think of them in the same room as them. They don't think of themselves as customers even. They think of them as other people. And actually, my view is that the ultimate long-term plan, and that's kind of what we're trying to do at Good Energy, is provide a blueprint where actually energy companies don't really exist anymore. We just become the facilitator for the rest of the market. So we look after about nearly 90,000 individuals who generate power in their own homes. And we have about the same number of customers. And what that means is that suddenly you have a different relationship. It's a two-way relationship. The power isn't just on one side. It's two sides. And for me, the future, if we're going to fix climate change, we're not going to fix it just with some big companies deciding what they're going to do. Because I absolutely assure you that is a really risky way to go, because they can make a different decision overnight. What we really need is a sort of groundswell of people being involved in this. And what's great about it is renewables are at the forefront of being able to do that. The solar industry is now generating something like 7 gigawatts of power from solar from pretty much zero 3 years ago. That's about half what the wind industry has done over the last 20 years. And it's amazing. That's amazing speed that we can do these things. If you want to build a new nuclear power station, it's going to take you 14 years. But if you want to build a solar park, you can build it in a month. And that's the dramatic transformation that we can see. So for me, the future is not just about big energy companies making all the decisions. It's actually about far more people being part of this marketplace. And I think probably one of the things I'm proudest of is not only the fact that we help support 90,000 people who generate power in their own home. We also look after 1,000 generators and communities and sort of landowners and farmers and cheesemakers and different people who generate power as well. And we provide a marketplace for them to use the power themselves, and then anything they don't need we'll take somewhere else. And for me, that is a real future. That's, for me, the vision of where we should go. This is another slide in terms of, actually, I'm going to skip that one because, again, I said too much numbers. What I want to talk about is this thing. So this was something I did at the RSA recently, which is called a constellation. I don't know how many people have used constellations. They're generally meant to sort of help people with their own issues, sort of long-term problems. But this was actually being used to deal with other problems in a wider context. And it was set up as an issue between environmental NGOs, campaigners, environmental companies, journalists, and some researchers. And essentially what it was there to do was to try and figure out what is stopping us from doing things about climate. And the particular question that was asked was, it was by an organisation called the Sainsbury's Foundation that's run the Ashton Awards. And they had started to get involved much more strongly in campaigning than they had before, which was making them feel quite uncomfortable because actually they're normally behind the scenes. And they stand shoulder to shoulder with some of their other environmental NGO partners. And she was basically asking, is this what we should be doing? And are we doing it enough? Or should we do it more, or should we do it less? And we set up the room, and what was fascinating, so if I can try and describe it so you can visualize it. So you had the two NGOs kind of on this side of the room, and there were 2 people in each NGO. And opposite them were 2 oil industry, 2 of the oil companies opposite. They then put the politicians in the middle, which was interesting, facing the other way. And that was the original setup. And the question was, are we doing enough? And what was fascinating is the first startup was that the oil companies felt really comfortable with that. They didn't feel threatened by that. They didn't feel on the spot on that. Because what they felt was actually there were these two organisations that weren't quite sure whether they wanted to engage with them. Politicians were facing the other way. And actually they felt, come on, bring it on. We can cope with these guys. And it was fascinating to see. And it was kind of sitting there, and no matter where, because what you do in a constellation is then move people to see whether you can get a better result. And whatever they could do with that, they couldn't get an answer. So the person who was pulling it together was then asked by the facilitator, are you missing anybody in here? So she said, okay. So she then brought two people to represent her kids, which is the future, and she kind of put them on the outside. And they kind of stared and glared at everybody, actually, stand out here. But again, they weren't very sort of interested. And what was fascinating is that one of the people from the oil company said, actually, what we want is the renewables industry to come in. Because all we've got is a bit of a fight going on about invest, but there's no kind of alternative to us, so we can't see where to go. So they then brought the renewables industry in. And it was moving a bit, but it was still, the renewables industry felt left out because we were kind of on the edge, and the politicians were still facing the wrong way. And the children were just sitting there glaring at everybody, and people would kind of look at them and then not bothering, actually, not focused on them at all. And so the facilitator then brought in the previous session, we'd had this person who was climate change, a really quite scary, big, and then the guy who played it was really quite scary as well. And they brought him in, and it was quite funny, and they brought him in on the side, so a really big hitter to stand next to the environmental NGOs. And immediately, the kind of really difficult oil company lost his power. It was fascinating. He stepped back immediately, didn't want this guy there at all, and suddenly felt really weak and didn't know what to do. And the other oil company felt that a bit, but was actually trying to move away from that oil company. So we'd split the oil companies by that point. And it was fascinating. So you basically going, okay, so some oil companies are going to be worse than others. Maybe we might mention Exxon at this point. I don't know if anybody saw what the announcement last week when it's actually come out in the Daily Mail. Irony beyond all irony. That 27 years ago, they've been funding to try and undermine all the science of climate. So you need to take out the big ones, and then we need to see, okay, so the fossil fuel, how do we then transfer them? And then what happened is it all kind of kept moving, but eventually we ended up with 3 people. So climate basically took out the big oil company, and I wonder whether the climate sort of big person is somebody like the Pope, actually, so coming in and being that really powerful force next to the NGOs. And then we ended up with a 3-way conversation between the Ashton Awards, renewables, and the oil industry. Because the oil industry wanted to figure out where they could go. And this is the point, is that we have to, for me, if we're going to divest, we then have to show, well, where are we going to invest next? Because you can't just take your money away, you need to put it somewhere else and put it to use. And for me, that's what's so important. And I walked away from that going, wow, that was incredibly powerful. This place where actually sort of you split the oil industry, you bring in some really big hitters now, and that's what we need to do. But then you try and figure out what the future looks like now and try and work out how you get those oil companies to move from this place to the next place. Now, I've been given my 5-minute warning. Is that about time now? Okay, so I'm going to finish there. And thank you very much for putting up my figures. I'm sorry for flicking. I just thought they were too much on a sort of sunny hot day.